to Make Some Plans podcast. My name's Angelo.
And I'm Kelly.
In today's podcast, we're going to talk about beer.
Beer! And because Angelo worked as a brewer, we thought this would be the perfect opportunity to talk about different types of beer and the science of brewing.
Yeah, so I'll try my best to explain it for someone who's worked in a brewery for 2 years or almost 2 years, and hopefully I'll be able to answer any questions you give me.
We are going to start off with how did you get into the brewing industry?
Well, I started looking for jobs after I spent a year off of college, just finishing some research at school, and then studying for the MCAT, which is another episode. Basically, when I graduated with a biology degree, I was looking for lab jobs mostly, so any lab technician or lab assistant jobs that were pretty much just across many disciplines. I didn't really think about that too much. Mostly like biotech companies and lab assistant jobs in like hospitals and stuff like that. So I was just looking on Indeed and I saw an ad for a lab technician job in a brewery, which was very interesting. It was the only one I saw of its kind. And I guess the connection to brewing sort of that I had was in one of my microbiology classes in senior year. We made beer as part of the kind of like last final fun project that we did, and that was kind of like the only sort of insight I had into making beer. But of course I went in thinking that would be a lab technician. So I applied to that job along with others, and that one got back to me, and so they gave me a call and told me that I wasn't going to be considered for the lab tech job, but they said that they had positions open in the brewery for production, which was completely different from what I was looking for. But at the time I was just kind of looking and pretty desperate for a job, so I just took the opportunity to interview with them, and I liked the what they were doing and the atmosphere there, so I took the job.
Were you interested in beer prior to the job, or did you get in beer because of the job?
Well, I would drink beer, and I was kind of interested in different types of beer when I go to restaurants or bars or tap rooms, and I didn't really know anything about the different types of beer, but I was just curious, and I just tried different beers, and I that's kind of how I became interested in it. Not really any very high interest or knowledge prior to the job.
Walk me through a typical day as a brewer.
As a brewer, there's basically you're basically like being inserted into the different processes along the brewing process. So there's the actual like brewing in the brew house, so like the hot side, and then in the middle there's like the cellaring side where the beer is actually already in the fermenter and you're just having it age and ferment out, and then there's like the filtration side, so that's after it's done fermenting and you want to get the beer into bottles or cans, you have to filter it. So there's like kind of those three areas in the brewery that we're pretty much mainly focused on. On the brewing side, the brewery we were at was more automated, but you're going to expect to have to handle malt, like you're going to be touching and like handling bags of malt or totes of malt. You're going to be expected to like handle hops, so you're going to be throwing hops in to the kettle, or you're going to be like weighing them out, digging through different varieties of hops. There's a lot of stuff involved on the cellaring side. You're going to be, dropping yeast is what it's called. It's when you are removing yeast and other particulates that settle to the bottom throughout the cellaring process to like help clarify the beer. You're going to be like checking the concentration of sugar and alcohol in the beer. You're going to be, dry hopping beers if that's required. You're going to actually like throw extra hops in while it's in the fermenter. And then on the filtration side, that's when you're taking the beer that was in the cellar and then filtering it, so clarifying it. And that's like, it can be a long process because filtration, you're trying to separate like the clarified beer from all like the different particulates, so that can take a long time because sometimes filters clog up depending on what type of media you're using, and the filtration would take like sometimes 6 to 8 hours. So sometimes that can be a whole shift. So there's different areas in the brewery that you're going to be like working in, and then there's all these other tasks around the brewery like cleaning. So they always say like when you're working in a brewery that you should be expected to like do a lot of cleaning. So a lot of times like we'd be scrubbing floors and like cleaning off different surfaces because at the end of the day it is like it's a production facility, so you're trying to make sure it's clean. So.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let's start with some basic terms in a brewery. Like you mentioned malt, and you mentioned hops. Like, what is that?
Yeah, I can just explain in general like the overview of the brewing process.
Okay.
So basically you have malt, and there's a variety of different types of malt. Basically malt is your source of the sugars. So what we do is we take the malt and then we have to almost like crack them open to expose the inside of the malt so that the sugars can be, accessed. So once that's cracked open, you basically send it into a vessel that heats it up, and then you stir it with water, and then you basically make this mash, is what it's called, and that slurry is going to have like a bunch of sugars in it, and then the process of heating also activates different enzymes in the malt that can help convert sugars. So the process with heating the mash is basically to break down like the complex sugars into simpler sugars, because the simpler sugars are what yeast is actually going to be able to ferment into alcohol. So once you have all those sugars kind of in that slurry, you basically steep them out, and what we had was called a lauter tun. So it was basically like this vessel with a floor that had slats in it, and it's basically like a big steeper, so it basically holds all the malt while allowing the wort is what it's called to seep through. So wort, that's like WORT. So that's basically your sugar water, and then that sugar water is then brought over to another kettle, and that kettle is going to be used to heat up and boil the wort, and that's where you add like your hops and stuff.
What is hops?
It's a flowering plant that has oils and resins that impart like certain different aromatic flavors and bitterness. So the flavors and the bitterness, or the bitterness specifically, comes from this acid. Okay. It's called alpha acid.
Okay.
And when you boil the hops with your wort, your sugary water, the hops, it basically isomerizes is the word. It isomerizes the alpha acid.
So for listeners and viewers who don't know what isomerize means.
I don't even know what that means. I think I know what it means.
Okay.
It's like a conformational change. Basically, isomerizing the alpha acids it's changing its formation so that it gives you perceivable bitterness.
Okay.
So the alpha acids turn from one form to another chemical compound, and that allows you to perceive bitterness in the beer.
Okay.
So the more hops you put in, and the longer you boil it, the more bitterness you get in your beer.
Okay.
So if you boil it for 5 minutes, you'll get less bitterness than if you boiled it for 60 minutes.
Okay. And so that's basically the general process of brewing.
Yeah, so then once you boil it for however long, and also boiling also helps to sterilize the wort, so any growth of bacteria or microorganisms that you have in there will be completely killed off, so it's sterile. And then once you have that wort with all the hops, you basically send it to the fermenter. Hi everyone, this is an editor's note. I forgot to explain that between the beer going from the brew house to the fermenter, it actually has to be chilled or cooled down in order to have the beer reach the optimum temperature for fermentation with the yeast. So between the beer going from the brew house to the fermenter, it needs to be cooled down, and yeast needs to be pitched into the beer so that when it gets into the fermenter, fermentation can start. Once you add the yeast to it, it basically ferments, and you have to track the fermentation based on how fast it ferments, and then the temperature it's fermenting at, and how much alcohol it's producing. Okay. So once you catch like a specific alcohol like volume that you have in there, that's when you'd want to stop the fermentation.
How does it go from fermentation to production?
Yeah, so once it's in the cellar, it's like the cellaring process. You're kind of keeping track of its alcohol and its sugar content. When it starts out, there's like a lot of sugar and there's no alcohol because the yeast hasn't fermented yet. So the yeast is happy at a specific temperature, so you have to set your fermenter to a specific temperature, and then basically yeast growth will start, and it will basically start fermenting the sugars, and then you keep track of that, and you'll see that sugar concentration will go down and your alcohol will slowly start going up. And then once you reach a certain point that you're happy with in terms of like alcohol and sugar content, that's when you it's what it's called crashing the fermenter. So you basically take the yeast out of the temperature range that it's able to ferment, so you cool it down. So cooling it down will cause the yeast activity to go down, and then that's how you can stop the fermentation at a specific alcohol and sugar concentration that you want.
So let's go back a little bit to what you would describe yeast as. Because we all hear about it when we bake bread, but what is it?
Yeah, to my knowledge, yeast is just it's a microorganism, so you need like a microscope to see it. And it's just a single-celled organism that it's consuming sugars and does fermentation. So it turns sugars, or it uses those sugars for its own energy, and it spits out alcohol or ethanol.
Okay.
So that's basically what yeast is.
Okay.
There's different types of yeast strains. Like whenever you hear like lager or ale or hefeweizen, those are all different yeast strains. And each yeast actually imparts its own like flavor. So not only do you get flavor from your malt and your hops, there's also different flavor characteristics from the different yeast. Because yeast not only, obviously it's like, it has other byproducts besides ethanol. So it's also giving flavor to the beer at the same time.
I didn't know that.
While we're on the topic of yeast, you know, there's specific fermentation temperatures for yeast. I don't remember them specifically, but like for ales, it's higher than lagers. So there's different yeast strains, and they are all different like species of yeast, if you could say that.
Okay.
And they all operate at different temperatures. The lager yeast, and our brewery did metric, so it was 9 degrees Celsius, if I remember correctly, versus ale was like 16 or 17 degrees Celsius.
Okay.
So you can see the temperature difference there. And they just like to operate at that temperature. So if you put lager yeast in the ale temperature, it won't work.
Oh, I see. Okay. So it's like specific. If you want to make a specific type of beer, then all of these things have to kind of like check off a box to make sure that you're producing that type.
Yeah, pretty much. Okay. You know, to be an ale, you have to have ale yeast, obviously, and to use ale yeast, you need to be at a certain temperature for fermentation.
What are the different types of beer and the different tastes that you could expect from those types?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I I obviously worked in a brewery and I tasted lots of beer, but I can't say I have the best palate for it.
Okay.
But I'll try to explain my best.
Yeah.
So lager beer. I mean, that's like very broad, obviously, because there's different types of lagers. There's like German lagers, there's Vienna lagers, there's like the Czech Pilsner lagers.
Yeah.
There's like the American ones, like the Coors Light and the Budweiser. But, you know, basically, lagers are going to be pretty light. Like the color, it's going to be very light yellow or, you know, very bright colored. And the malt they're using is like very simple. It's just like the very simple either Pilsner malt or it's not pale malt, Pilsner malt, yeah. So it's just like very light colored malt. So the color from the beer comes from the malt.
Okay.
So it's like light colored, and typically it's not hopped very much, so has very light hop like profile. So you're not gonna get a lot of bitterness. So it's like very crisp and refreshing, and the alcohol is typically like lower than what you'd expect from like an IPA. It's like 4.5 to 5 at most. Ale is like.
Is it the next step up? Like, should we go from lightest to like darkest?
I guess ale would be like your next step up in terms of color, yeah. But there's also different types of ales. There's just like pale ales, which is just it's using pale malt and ale yeast, and it's not really like heavy on the hops. It's just like very like, you know, moderate ale beer, and the color is like slightly more orange compared to a lager. And then you have like your IPA, so that stands for like Indian Pale Ale. So that's still an ale yeast used in the beer, but you're using a lot more hops in an IPA. And typically the alcohol is also higher in an IPA.
It's also a lot bitter.
Yeah, and there's more hops, and you're boiling them for longer, and you're converting more of those alpha acids to like bittering units. So, I mean, that would be your like ascension in terms of ABV. Like IPAs are typically like in the 6.5, And then after that, there's like stouts. So that's using like really dark malt. And yeah, I mean, those are going to be like a lot thicker in your mouthfeel. And in certain cases, a lot sweeter too. Because you're more focusing with stouts more on the sugar aspect of it versus the hop aspect. So
what's a hef?
the hef is like completely like on another spectrum too, because that's using Hefeweizen yeast.
Oh, okay.
So that's different yeast from ale and lager.
Oh, I see.
And it's gonna be really sweet. Sometimes people describe it as having like a clove or banana like flavor to it, just from the yeast that's used, that's imparted by it. So that's like a traditional like German style Hefeweizen.
You know, kombucha has been very popular. Would you say that kombucha has the same type of process?
Kombucha? I'm not too familiar with kombucha, but I did have a coworker who made kombucha, and it's basically like similar process. You're fermenting sugars, but you're fermenting sugars from tea. And I don't remember the yeast they use, but it's not like a beer yeast. It's a different yeast strain. But you do the same thing. You steep your tea leaves to get the sugar, and then you add your yeast, and then you basically wait for it to ferment.
What's a Kolsch?
Kolsch it's actually a style. So at the brewery I worked at, we had like Kolsch yeast, but then we also made a Kolsch that had ale yeast. So Kolsch is just a style, is my understanding, and it's a beer that's made in Germany. So it's like if a beer is made in the city of Cologne, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, that's a Kolsch. So it's a beer that's just made in the style that's made in Cologne, Germany.
Oh, I see.
So if you make a Kolsch here, it's not really a true Kolsch. It's like a Kolsch style beer. So that's why one of the beers that we made for another brewery, it's like called Kolsch style ale, KSA, because it's a Kolsch style ale that's trying to mimic the style that's made in Germany. Kolsch is just like it's similar to lager in the taste, like or a pilsner, but it's just like, I think it's a little bit drier.
Okay.
And it's not going to have lots of hops either. I know some pilsners are robustly hopped, so they have a little bit more bitterness. Kolsches are typically just very, very like crisp and light and not a lot of hops.
Let's get into seltzers, because those are very popular now. Is it the same brewing process?
Yeah, seltzers. So seltzers, it's not gonna have malt. It's gluten free. So that's the difference. The main difference right there with from beer. So seltzers are actually just using, like I think sometimes they're using corn syrup. Sometimes they're using just like straight up sugar, like cane sugar, and you're basically using that as your sugar source to ferment. So the yeast that they use for seltzers, I think it depends. Sometimes it's like wine yeast. Sometimes it's different other types of seltzer yeast that I'm not too familiar with. I wasn't really involved on the side of picking the yeast. But yeah, you're basically doing the same thing. You're taking your water and putting the sugar in there, boiling it just to like, sterilize it. And then you're getting your yeast and throwing it in there and fermenting it, and waiting for the alcohol to come up and the sugar to go down. And then the thing with seltzers is they have flavors in them, right?
How does that work?
We made 2 seltzers for 2 different breweries that kind of did them differently. One seltzer, we actually added like fruit puree and different fruit adjuncts is what it's called, into the kettle. So that's where we boil the the slurry of sugars, right? So the kettle had, sometimes it'd be like I think mango and pineapple and orange and guava and stuff like that. Just all these different flavors that would boil, and then that would actually, all those flavors would be fermented with the yeast. We also made it another way where we would just take the sugar water and ferment it with no flavors, and then we'd end up with almost basically like alcohol, and then we'd water it down and at the same time add different flavors after the fact. So the difference there being like we add flavors after fermentation versus adding flavors before fermentation, and to me like they tasted almost the same. But that's like my understanding is there's 2 different ways you can do that for the addition of flavors.
Interesting. I didn't know that seltzers, there's like different ways of making them?
Yeah, the seltzers are pretty popular now.
Yeah.
And I think overall it's easier to make because you're not having to deal with malt or hops. The fermentation process is pretty simple. It's straightforward. You're just like fermenting sugar water.
Yeah.
And you don't really have to worry about as much like off flavors and stuff like that that's associated with other types of beer. And you don't have to like worry about like masking those flavors if they do come up, because you're just adding a bunch of like fruit and stuff like that. So it's to my understanding, it's like easier to make. I'm not sure if it's cheaper or more expensive though.
Ciders are also very popular. How do you make one?
Yeah, ciders are, like the same with beer. You're taking sugars from apples.
Okay.
Actually apple juice like itself, and then you're using yeast to ferment it. So I can just talk about how we made cider at our brewery. Basically a tanker of cider would come in, and it's just straight up apple juice. We'd basically take that and then we'd pasteurize it just to make sure it was all,
like sterile,
free of microbes and stuff like that. And then we'd put it in a fermenter, straight into the fermenter. It doesn't go through the brew house actually. So we go into the fermenter and then we just add yeast. We actually used our own ale yeast to make our cider. So you basically just take the cider and then ferment it for like a week and a half at a certain temperature. And yeah.
I had a strawberry cider yesterday, so it's basically strawberry juice and going through the same process.
The flavored cider is what it was basically. So it was basically the same cider that was, it's based off the base, the normal cider, but we added like flavor after the fact.
I see. Okay, so it's still apple juice as a base. Okay. You mentioned earlier that sometimes the brewery would be working around the clock. How did you guys manage to plan to run for 24 hours? And what if something goes wrong?
The brewery had, a lot of things that would stop us from brewing. A lot of times was just maintenance issues, like something would break, and that obviously pushes the schedule back. But basically we had a weekly outlook, or actually like annual outlook, so we would know what we're doing like every week, like this week or even like 4 or 5 weeks out. So we basically just tried to keep up with the schedule and do our best. And really when you're brewing like 24/7 and you're doing like brew after brew after brew, there's really no downtime. And you're pretty much just always just on time or behind. There were rarely times when we got ahead of schedule. So pretty much just keeping the 24/7 rolling. We basically just made sure that there were sufficient staffing and that the people on staff were capable. We would always make sure that we had someone as like a shift lead who was more experienced, and then the person who would come on with them would be like a newer person, like I was at one point. So I'd be working with like more experienced people. So we're always making sure that that there were people on staff and on site who were capable of like solving problems and making sure that we are on track.
What happens when you do actually fall behind?
Well, when we're behind, like for example, let's say we were supposed to start brewing this beer at like Wednesday at midnight, and we were, we had problems with maintenance, so we had to start brewing at like Wednesday at 10 a.m. So 10-hour like delay. There's nothing you can do, right? You can't speed up the brewing process. You basically just push everything back.
Okay.
And that would be a conversation to have like between the head brewer, my boss, and then the production and fulfillment team, like on the business side, because they're the people who are actually like talking with the vendors and talking with the the different people that we're making beer for to tell them, hey, like we're gonna have to like push back this. So really on our side as brewing team and department, there's nothing we can really do.
So it sounds like there's just a lot of players involved and a lot of communication that needs to happen if that happens.
Yeah, so basically there's actually like the same team that I was speaking of, the business side of it, and the fulfillment team, the production team. They're the people who make the like outlook for the year. So basically the production of beer in our brewery is based on like the previous fiscal year, and we make estimates based on that for the next coming year. So we already know what we're making, like a fixed amount of volume, and the team will decide that, and then that's what we're following. Most of the time we're not making beer based on what people ask of us. like in the future, but it's what they're asking of us like previously.
Oh, okay.
Because there's like seasonality
with
beer production. So
okay.
we based like beer production of the summer, of the upcoming summer, based on like last summer.
It's a lot of data that goes into it. Let's say someone super brand new, does not know anything about beer. What type of beer would you recommend to them?
I would probably just recommend some sort of ale or some IPA, like some sort of West Coast IPA. I think starting off with like craft lagers is too similar to having like a cheap American beer. I think, to me, I think the best thing to do is to get a sense of what beer has to offer is just jump right in and then go from there. And then you can start like exploring like different avenues. But I think since right now the beer industry is so into like IPAs and stuff like that, just I think it's best to just start there.
Yeah. Okay, so it's basically going with the trend. Let's say that someone is trying to get into craft beers. What would you recommend for them to start?
To drink craft beer. I mean,
or just beer in general.
Yeah, I mean that's a good question, and I think the best answer I could give personally is like to have like an open mind about beer, because if you're coming from like the normal American lagers like Budweiser and Coors Light, and that's not to say that they're terrible beers. I mean, they have their own like merits on their own, but if you're coming from that and trying to go into craft beer, just like have an open mind. I think the best thing to do is just go on Yelp and look at different breweries around your area, and literally just walk into the tap room and look at the menu and whatever interests you. Ask them about it. Ask them about like what kind of beer is this? Like what flavors can I expect? And what is it similar to? And then you can even ask the bartender or the taproom person to give you a sample and like try it. They're always open to do that. So in terms of like trying out new beers in a taproom, definitely do that. If you're going to a grocery store and looking to buy a 6-pack of a craft beer that you're interested in, like literally, packaging is like a big part of beer marketing, and I think it's an important part of like having a beer that's accessible to people. So look at the packaging and like actually read the packaging.
What is your favorite type right now?
My favorite type of beer right now?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a good question. When I first started working, I was basically just drinking like lagers and American beer, like from macro breweries like Budweiser and Coors Light. And then once you like learn more about craft beer, you started wanting to drink all the IPAs and stuff like that. Like I recommended, you start out, and then it kind of circled around to like back to the German lagers and the more craft lagers, and then stuff like the stouts, and there's also different types of there's also different German styles like Doppelbocks and Märzens and all these other styles. So I think I kind of like circled back around. So mostly lagers now I drink.
This is going to be a fun question. Based on the type of beers that you have explained, if you could assign personalities to them, how would you describe like each type of beer?
Okay. Personality types to beer? Yeah, I hope I don't like offend anyone.
No, it's just like a fun question.
Yeah, I would think IPAs are kind of like, and I don't know the word for it, but let's say like if someone was an IPA, they'd be like really shouty and like.
What does that mean?
They'd be like very open and like shouty about their personality.
Like outgoing?
Yeah, outgoing.
Okay.
They'd be very outgoing and like out there, because IPAs are always like pushing the limit of like how many hops can I add, different varieties of hops can I add. They're adding all these different types of things like lactose to make the milkshake IPA.
Oh yeah.
They're adding all these different different flavor profiles that they're claiming are in their IPAs. So I think it's like a very like shouty, open, outgoing personality. I think lagers are just so traditional, and I don't think anyone's tried to mess with the formula too much. Like there's just very fixed styles. Like that's why in Germany like they only make lagers, and they're very like traditional about it. So it's like very fixed in like what the recipe calls for. When people are trying to make IPAs, they're trying to push the boundary. When people are making lagers, I think they're just trying to go as close to traditional as possible. So I think a lager would be someone who's very reserved and very proper. And then you have like
stouts.
Like stouts. I think they'd be very like bold. I think stouts are very bold. Like the flavor is like very like strong. People who've never drank one before, they'll be caught off by how like sweet it is, and at the same time how like strong the alcohol flavor can be, because stouts are typically like high ABV. So I think that person would be very bold and like daring, and willing to take a lot of risks.
What about ales?
Well, ales like pale ale, because like IPAs are ales, but you have like pale ales, and you have like, I think they're, I don't know. I don't know about ales. I don't know.
Well, that is it for our very first episode on beer. Thank you, Angelo, for explaining a lot of these things to me, and I hope that you guys have a new appreciation for beer. Thank you so much for watching and listening. See you guys next time. Bye!